You have an Indian guy who's not familiar with the scripture, not familiar with the book of Revelation, and he's describing what John describes in the book of Revelation, 12 gates.
And angels out guarding him. And then he said, I knew I was looking at the kingdom of heaven, and I desperately wanted to go in. Commonalities line up exactly with what Scripture has been telling us all along of our expectation of the afterlife. And so imagine heaven was really focused on that, on looking at what Scripture's expectation of the afterlife is, but illustrated through the eyes of these people who, when they clinically died, no heartbeat, no brain waves, for minutes to hours, and yet they come back and consistently they had overlapping explanations of what they experienced. Look, you know, like I have a Hindu manufacturing engineer, grew up in India. Hinduism was all he knew. And yet when he hears code blue, his pancreas erupted into his gallbladder and it basically killed him. And he finds himself, like the commonalities, up above his body, able to see his body. And then this brilliant God of light comes to him. And he said, I knew this was divine. I knew this light was divine. And he said, I instantly fell in love with this light. And then this light takes him and to this place, and he describes the city of God just like John does in Revelation chapter 21. But he doesn't know what he's talking. He calls it a giant compound. In India, there are all these walled compounds. Someone has a near-death experience, they can still come back and interpret it in their own cultural worldview.
Yes.
So for instance, I was telling you about Santosh, right? Who sees the holy city of God, and he describes it, this giant walled
Well, you said he's
compound.
from India?
Yeah.
And he was an engineer.
He was an engineer. He's traveled the world as an engineer.
So he dies, and he has this experience, and he describes it as a gigantic walled compound.
Yes, beautiful, gorgeous. Inside these, he calls them mansions. He said that. Big buildings of otherworldly building material, and he could see people. And he said, and your eyesight is like telescopic there, which is a commonality I wrote about.
I can't wait to die.
Yeah. Thousands of miles.
But seriously.
A square-shaped, he said, and 12 gates. I counted them, he said.
You have an Indian guy who's not familiar with the scripture, not familiar with the book of Revelation, and he's describing what John describes in the book of Revelation, 12 gates.
And angels out guarding him. And then he said, I knew I was looking at the kingdom of heaven, and I desperately wanted to go in. And then he has a vision of hell, which he describes as a just abyss of darkness. And then he turns and he sees who he calls the Almighty on a throne. But to the left side, he has and he looks into his eyes, and he describes the glorified Jesus. He said his eyes were like lightning. Well, that's what Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 7, John and Revelation 1, right? He sees the same thing. And then he has a life review, and he sees all of his good, but all of his bad too. And he realizes, I deserve that.
I deserve hell.
Yes. And when the Lord speaks to him, he's shocked because he says, Santosh, I'm sending you back. And when I send you back, I want you to love your family. I want you to love especially your daughter. She needs your help right now. Now think about that. He doesn't know God, but God knows him. And that's true of all of us. It's something we have to realize. You know, God is the God of all nations. And so after Santosh, it's a longer story, but basically he said, I was shocked because the Lord was so tender and merciful and compassionate toward me. I didn't expect that. And then he sees what he called a narrow gate or door open to the kingdom of heaven to him. And he says to the Lord, when I come back, I want to go through that narrow door into the kingdom of heaven. How do I go through it? And they have a conversation about the wages of sin is death, walk with me, surrendered. When he comes back, he's saying, who was this God of compassion and mercy and love that I met? This is not like the gods I knew.
What do you mean when he comes back? What do you mean?
Well, he's resuscitated.
Okay.
So he comes back. He was 3 days in a medically induced coma when his heart wouldn't start.
Okay.
He revives. He starts seeking God, and he's praying. And 2 years later, his daughter is invited to sing in a choir at a church because she was a choral major. he goes to visit, and as he walks in, he feels the presence of that loving God, and the message is on the narrow gate.
Oh.
And how Jesus is the gate through which you enter the kingdom of heaven.
2 years later.
And he comes to faith. Now, that could be a one-off, like, oh, well, good story. Except the whole book is filled with them. 70 people in there. Swidik, who was, is still in Rwanda, a Muslim Imam, an apologist, who dies of blood cancer, but his mom in desperation is now praying to Jesus because nothing else would save her son.
And a mom whose mother is praying for him
Yes.
because she's so desperate that she decides, what the heck, I'll pray to Jesus.
She goes to the church.
Interesting.
Gets them praying to Jesus. He says, out of a hellish experience, he appears this man of light in a robe with a beard who holds out his hands and has holes in his wrists. And he says, I died for mankind. You're among those I died for. Never deny it and tell everyone. Here's why, and why they don't talk about it as well. Heavenly or hellish. They say it's more real than anything they've ever experienced here.
Jesus holds the keys of your present life and afterlife. Only Jesus can connect you to God because He is the only way. Heaven or hell is your choice. Be wise. Choose heaven. Why should you perish?